trouble on the M1. Hello and welcome to episode 220 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm your host, Ken Ray. Last summer, Apple announced that it was moving the Mac to its own processors, dubbed Apple Silicon. The transition to Apple Silicon will take a couple of years to complete, though the first Apple Silicon processor, the M1, is already powering a few machines. Last summer, Apple Silicon was announced, the first Apple Silicon hit in the fall. Then came winter, when it was hit by malware. Security researcher Patrick Wardle fills us in on this edition of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. Over the past couple of weeks, a couple of pieces of malware have been found targeting the M1 Mac. Patrick Wardle used to work for the NSA. Today he's sort of an expert at large where security and the Mac are concerned, and he was kind enough to talk malware and the M1 with me earlier this week. So on your blog you wrote about a piece of malware designed specifically for the M1 Mac. I'm wondering just if you could start off by telling us about GoSearch 22.
Yeah, GoSearch 22 is an interesting piece of adware, although probably the most interesting component of it is the fact that it is compiled to natively run on Apple's new M1 or ARM64 chips. This is something that we've been expecting to see for a while, as malware authors are obviously quite aware of Apple's changes, both at the hardware and software level. But as far as we know, this was the first in the wild sample with this native compatibility. So that's really kind of the interesting component of that.
Now, when I was telling listeners about this one on another show that I do, macOS Ken, I said that there seemed to be good news, bad news around this one. The bad news, the antivirus testing platform where you found the malware, missed this one a few times over. The good news, according to a piece from Engadget, GoSearch 22 was signed with an Apple Developer ID in November. However, Apple has revoked the adware certificate, which will make it difficult for users to install. Now, I want to actually ask about, because I have a feeling for somebody in what you do, this is sort of a remedial question, but can you help me out with the antivirus testing platform? I mean, if it's there, it's malware, right? How did the site not find it?
Yeah, so the website we're kind of chatting about is a website called VirusTotal, and the idea behind VirusTotal is it's a way for people to submit files, both ones they suspect to be malicious, but ones that are possibly benign as well, to the site, and then VirusTotal has agreements with all the major antivirus vendors and has licensed their engines. And so then this uploaded file that the user submits is subjected to scans by 50 plus different AV engines. So the interesting thing about GoSearch 22, I could actually look at some of the submission information, some of the submission details, and see it was submitted by a user, but it had been originally picked up by one of Objective-C tools. Now, the Objective-C tools I create don't, by design, specify if something is malware or not. They merely say, hey, this is persistently installed on your system. It's perhaps, unsigned or unrecognized. You might want to take a closer look at it. So what the user did, which was the right thing to do in this case, was submit it to the VirusTotal platform. It appeared that at the time, 4 of the antivirus engines did pick it up because GoSearch 22, which turned out to be a variant of a very well-known but very insidious piece of adware called Pirate. It was a new variant, but it did share a lot of similarities with old versions. So this is why 4 of the antivirus engines were able to detect and flag this new variant. So that's good-ish news. I mean, that still means 50 or so of the antivirus engines did not originally detect that. This is unsurprising in a way. New variants often have new code, new byte sequences. So a lot of these antivirus engines, which use static signatures or signatures based on certain byte sequences, may not have detected it. Better news, though, now we're up to, I believe it's something like 20, 25 plus of the engines detecting that. Most of the major ones. There's a lot of engines on the site that are kind of one-offs, and so I discount a lot of those. But now, the majority of the antivirus engines are detecting it. At least the Intel version of the virus. You did mention the fact that Apple revoked the certificate means that the malware can no longer infect new systems unless the malware developers sign it with another developer ID that has not yet been revoked. So that's good news, and that's some proactive steps that Apple took. And actually, when I uncovered the malware recently by digging through submitted files on the VirusTotal website, at that time, Apple had already revoked the certificate. So I believe they actually already knew about this and had taken some proactive steps, but then, didn't make any public noise or bring any public awareness to the specific virus, which, is generally what Apple does. They do not. They like to keep things kind of quiet, out of mind, out of sight.
I do want to ask some more questions about the certificates and revoking those in a bit when we get to Silver Sparrow. But let me ask you one more question really quickly about GoSearch 22. As far as the malware itself, you told Motherboard that the malware itself is fairly vanilla. How do you mean?
So what I meant by that was that it's really run-of-the-mill adware. So as we mentioned, it looks like it's a variant of the well-known Pirate adware, which the goal is to do things that is very common in adware. So, inject pop-ups into your browser session, perhaps hijack search engine results to redirect traffic or generate referral links, just basic activity to make the creators of the adware money, right? So it's really interested in financial gain. So it's pretty vanilla, pretty standard adware, right? It doesn't have any interesting capabilities from my point of view. It's not really doing anything new per se. Really, the main takeaway was the fact that it appeared to be the first malicious code that we uncovered in the wild that was natively compatible with Apple's new M1 ARM64 systems.
And it didn't take long for a second piece to pop up. Let's go ahead now and talk about Silver Sparrow. Working from a piece in Ars Technica, they made this one seem sort of mysterious because nobody could tell exactly what it was doing. Is that right?
Yeah, which was kind of an interesting angle to take. So Silver Sparrow was detected by a company called Red Canary, good friends with some of the researchers there. So kudos to them for this uncovery. They also published a great technical blog articulating the malware. And one of the takeaways was, hey, we found this on a large number of systems. It persistently installs itself, but then it'll connect to a command and control server to download additional payloads. And they didn't recover any of the payloads, if I recall correctly. So, kind of the takeaway is this malware could be doing anything. We don't know what. I wouldn't say that's super mysterious per se. It's, in my opinion, just we don't have enough insight into what it's doing.
Okay. See, that was kind of the interesting thing to me because every article that I came across made it seem like this was a super mysterious thing. And at the same time, I don't want to say it sounded standard because I don't know enough to say what sounds standard and what doesn't. But it almost felt like, well, we're talking about only the second piece of malware for the M1. I mean, is this sort of, I don't want to say anybody was like trying to, it wasn't clickbaity necessarily because there is something weird about the fact that we have no idea what it was up to. I mean, is there any clue what the malware might be waiting for? What wire they're waiting for to be tripped before doing whatever they're going to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was kind of my takeaway as well, where, a lot of, my take is that it's a new variant or a new adware specimen versus, some cyber espionage backdoor. And, looks like its infection vector is through, maybe some search engine poisoning or malicious websites that try to coerce users into downloading and then installing it. My guess is then that is just a way to kind of seed an environment, infect a lot of users, and then you can swap in your adware-related payloads at a later time. So kind of step one is, growing a user base almost, and then, you can swap in and swap out perhaps different payloads based on let's say market trends in the adware space, right? Maybe the best way to make money this week is to generate referral links. Next week, it's perhaps injecting ads into web pages to get monetization based on views. But really, step one is you need to grow this user base if you're an adware author. So I think in that way, this is actually kind of standard. Really, to me, the main takeaway was not the fact that we don't know exactly what it does. It was more just like, hey, it has a customizable payload component. This isn't incredibly unusual. That's actually, good software design. To me, it was more how many systems it had infected, and also, again, that it kind of had some ability for native M1 code execution.
That's interesting, because the piece that I was working from said that Silver Sparrow also had a way to completely remove itself from an infected machine. The implication in that piece was that that's kind of the thing is reserved for sort of high stealth operations. You're making it sort of sound less like that and more like, well, I don't know. Can you elaborate on that a bit, or maybe talk about that disparity?
Sure. So in the past, I would agree. I would say that, basically any cyber espionage backdoor or any piece of malware that was designed by a sophisticated or competent adversary would have that capability, because if you infect a system, it's also nice to be able to remove yourself, in case there's an antivirus signature that comes out, or the user starts poking around. But at this point, it's becoming somewhat of a common feature, and something that, again, makes total sense. It's really, in a way, I always like to think of malware and adware as it's simply software, albeit with malicious intent. So well-designed software, right? You have an installer, but you also always have the ability to uninstall it. It's just like good software engineering practice. So, when we're looking at Silver Sparrow, it looks like they're using a kind of plug-in or modular-based design, which is good. That provides extensibility. Kind of, you can swap in different payloads as needed versus hard coding them. And then, it also makes makes sense that at some point you probably want to remove yourself from the infected system. So, it's not a feature we see in all malware, all adware. But again, I wouldn't say that this, to me, makes it, a high stealth operation. It's more, to me, just, hey, this was written by a competent software engineer who thought that, hey, it would be nice to have the ability to remove myself from infected systems. And you're like, yeah, that actually is a good idea.
Like a low-impact camper.
Exactly. Well, leave only footprints, and in the case of this, don't even leave those.
Right, if you can help it. There was the article that I was working from as well said that 30,000 machines were known to be infected at the time that it was written, which I guess was close to a week ago now as people hear this. I don't know how to deal with numbers. 30,000 doesn't sound like a lot to me when you consider that there are, however many billion people on the planet, however many tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Macs out there. I mean, when you consider how many Macs are out there, it doesn't seem like that big a deal. And yet the folks at Red Canary, the research firm, as you mentioned, that found the malware, see that number as sizable. Can you sort of boil those numbers down for me?
Yeah, it's another great question, Ken. And I think it really depends on kind of how you slice it. I agree with you 100% that, there are millions, if not hundreds of millions, if not billions of Macs around the world. I don't know the exact number. So, but regardless, 30,000 is a minuscule percentage. That having been said, it's first notable to point out that 30,000 number was based on Malwarebytes data from infections they had seen on endpoints where their software was installed. So in some sense, it was only actually a very limited subset, right? They had no visibility into systems that were not running Malwarebytes antivirus software. So I don't run Malwarebytes on my system. So if I was infected, that would not have been counted.
Gotcha.
Still, though, I mean, 30,000 is a decent chunk, and I think it shows that it's tens of thousands of infected Mac users. On one end, you kind of have Apple that gives off kind of or alludes to the fact that malware on Mac OS is incredibly rare, and if it happens, they react very quickly, so it's not widespread. So, here's a case where at least 30,000 infections, probably way more than that, is occurring in the wild. It's notable. I think it just reiterates that malware adware on the macOS platform is here to stay. And, in some scenarios, right, it's there's at least tens of thousands of infections that we know of. So I think that's really more, to me, kind of the larger takeaway in terms of that number.
Now, I had said earlier I wanted to circle back to what you were saying about the certificates. Not unlike GoSearch 22, Apple has taken action to stop the spread of Silver Sparrow. There was a piece I saw in Mac Rumors earlier this week that said that Apple had revoked the certificates of the developer accounts used to sign the packages, preventing additional Macs from being infected. It's good that they're stopping the spread. I'm wondering about machines that already have it.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. So first and foremost, to give Apple credit, a lot of times when malware is discovered, generally is signed so that it's allowed to run on systems, which gives Apple a really strong response in the fact that they can revoke the code signing certificate, which means that even if new users are coerced into, downloading and attempting to run the malware, the operating system, which checks every time a new application is run, if the certificate has been revoked, will actually protect the users in this scenario. So that's great. Basically is, stopping the spread in its tracks, which is great. My understanding is, though, this may not impact current infections. However, I will caveat that Apple has made some changes in Big Sur that I will have to dig in. But on previous versions of macOS, the certificate check was only performed, I believe, the first time the application was run. So once the malware is off and running, a revoked certificate doesn't even matter. I believe that, the majority of the infected systems will still run fine, especially if the persistent components are unsigned, which is often the case. You really need to only sign your installer. So a lot of the persistent components are unsigned, and those will be allowed to run. Apple has another kind of card that it can play, though. There is a built-in antivirus technology in all versions of macOS called MRT, which stands for the Malware Removal Tool. And what Apple can do is push out an update to that, and they often do that. This happens silently in the background. And that daemon will actually scan the system, and if it finds files that match its signature, it will actually take proactive steps to remove that. So because there is that component built into the operating system, my understanding is Apple would probably have to push out a signature for that, and that would address existing infections by removing the actual files.
More with Patrick in a moment, but first a word about MacScan 3 from SecureMac. Recent numbers from Canalys say Mac sales grew 16% in 2020. Gartner says Mac sales were up over 22%, while IDC says they were up 29%. No, they don't agree on the exact numbers, but they all agree on one thing. Lots of new Macs in 2020. You know what that means? Lots of new targets for bad guys. Stop them in their tracks with MacScan 3. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by SecureMac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for the Mac for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your machine. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then once you decide to buy for less. You can take a little off the cost of your subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first. Watch it kick those tracking cookies to the curb. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code CHECKLIST at securemac.com/MacScan. Well, I got to say, one of the coolest things that's happened for me and for this show over the past year is being able to occasionally call Patrick Wardle and say, hey, I have questions. Can you please answer them for me? This is not the only thing you do, though. What are you up to these days?
Yeah, so recently I have committed 100% of my time to focusing on Objective-C's community focus efforts. Kind of three main areas. First and foremost, working on Objective-C's free tools. I also have now open sourced all of Objective-C's tools. So you can pop over to the GitHub repo for Objective-C. All the source code has been open sourced and GPL'd, which is kind of neat. So spending a lot of time updating the tools, making them run smoothly with Apple's M1 processor, right, as developers and malware authors apparently are doing as well. And then also working on the Art of Mac malware book. I've signed a contract with a publisher, so I'm now working with an editor to put the final touches on that. So I'm really, really excited about that. Finally, also planning the next version of the Objective by the Sea Mac Security Conference. We're aiming for tentatively October in Europe, a small in-person event. So super excited about that. We're in the stage where we're talking to different venues, different hotels. So we're really talking to some neat locations. So I'm sure we'll have some more information about that sooner. But yeah, really excited to hopefully get that all planned out. And later this year, when things are hopefully back to more normal, having an in-person or at least a hybrid in-person virtual event, small Mac security conference where we talk about really interesting topics and have world-class speakers come to present their research.
Let me ask you a question really quickly, if you don't mind. And if you can't talk about it because you're still working with the publisher, that's fine. A couple of questions really fast, though. Is that going to be a print book or is that an online publisher?
Yeah, so great question. It's actually going to be a print book, but I've been very passionate and committed to the fact that there will be a free open source online version as well. And this publisher has actually agreed to that and has worked with authors in the past that have had a similar approach. So the goal is really to have, a free online version for students or those, who don't want a printed copy. And then there will be a printed copy at a price, obviously, to basically cover the materials and the printing process. So, if someone wants a physical book, there'll be an option for that. But again, it's really important for me that the content of the book remain 100% free online. Because again, really one of the goals of the book is to, create a resource for the community to help educate malware analysts, students, cybersecurity professionals, and really arm them with the tools and the foundational knowledge to fight against the ever-increasing, uptick in Mac and malware and adware.
I got to say, I know I'm getting caught on the wrong thing here, but one of the things that's been fascinating to me watching you work on the book is sort of the interactivity level online. I'm curious to see a printed copy of the book, just because I'm used to it being a thing that you can, point and click and all that. Let's get back to the malware question. So, and we're going to kind of broaden out a bit because we talked about Go Search 22 specifically. We talked about Silver Sparrow specifically. I want to back up and talk about malware and the M1. Yeah, and I don't want to sound like a know-it-all because I don't know anything, but we really shouldn't be surprised by this happening, right? I mean, the M1 can run programs that are meant for x86 processors. I mean, while coding for one is not the same as coding for the other, I mean, they're made to perform similar functions. This was going to happen.
Yeah. And Ken, that's actually a really good point to make because in a way, if you're using one of the more recent versions of Xcode, which is Apple's IDE, basically how you create, apps, programs for macOS, if you build your source code now, it will create what is known as a universal binary, which has both Intel code and M1 code within it, meaning that program will have native compatibility with the M1. So that was really not surprising at all, right? This is something we were going to see. And so really I was like, hey, I just want to see if malware authors are, actively working on their malware and creating native versions. And so really to me, that's not surprising at all. Like you said, something we were going to see. And as we talked about the Go Search 22 and Silver Sparrow, within, a week or a few days of each other, right? We have some examples already.
I was going to ask you if there was anything about the M1 that made it easier or more difficult to write malware, but it almost sounds like you've answered that question with the Xcode question. I mean, if you can write malware for one, is it accurate? If you can write malware for one, you can write malware for both?
Yeah, exactly. So again, this goes back to the fact that malware is simply software,
right,
albeit with kind of malicious intentions. The M1 chip provides a lot of additional security, but that's more focused to initial exploitation vectors. So not to get too technical, but in short, it's harder to remotely infect a system if it has an ARM-based processor versus the traditional Intel-based ones. But once you're on the machine and you have arbitrary code execution, a program is a program. And Apple has actually gone through great lengths to make it easy for code originally written to run on older systems to run, amazingly on newer systems as well. They abstract a lot of the low-level hardware details. So really, again, in one point of view, if we look at the fact that malware is simply software, there's essentially nothing more difficult about making it run on an Intel system versus a new M1 system.
Now, one of the cool things about the M1 is that it's Apple Silicon. And, of course, the A-series processors that power iPhones and iPads are also Apple Silicon. We just weren't calling it that back in the day. Should the arrival of malware for the M1 change the way we think about the safety of our, iPhones and iPads?
I would really say not at all. Again, really the chip component, M1 versus Intel versus, the A-series one, to malware generally makes no difference. It's really the impact or the challenges are A, in terms of exploitation, that kind of getting your initial foot in the door, and B, then the software-based or OS-level restrictions that are placed. So on iOS, those operating system restrictions are way more stringent. For example, only code that runs from the official iOS App Store, and it's all sandboxed, right? Mac OS says, you can run code from the internet as long as it's signed and notarized. So those are OS-level restrictions. One interesting thing, though, in the context of malware and M1 that I think we should kind of touch on is the fact that antivirus programs may struggle to detect some of the malware if it's been compiled for M1. And I really think that was, to me, the most interesting takeaway, if we kind of loop back to the Go Search 22 stuff, was not that it had a component that could run natively on the M1 chips, is that when I split out the Intel component and the ARM or M1 component and scanned those individually, there was about a 15% drop in the detection of the M1 version versus the Intel version. So that indicated that some antivirus products, even really well-known ones, that were able to successfully identify the Intel version missed the ARM version, even though from a logical point of view, the code is identical. There's no functional difference. My explanation is some of those signatures were perhaps on certain byte sequences, which are going to be different when you compile code versus Intel versus M1 systems. So I think that's really the bigger takeaway, is that we just need to make sure that if we're creating security tools or antivirus programs, that our signatures and our detections are not architecture specific, because we are going to see more and more programs, malware included, that can have been built to run natively on M1 systems. And if our security tools can't handle that's problematic. So that to me is really probably the biggest takeaway from this from a security point of view.
You heard Patrick say earlier that he's concentrating on his own stuff now. There are a couple of ways to keep track of what that stuff is. First, you can follow him on Twitter. At Patrick Wardle is where to see him tweet. That's PatrickWardle at Patrick Wardle, or twitter.com/Patrick Wardle. Now, for a deeper dive, check out his website, objectivec.com. Lots of open source tools there for the security minded. Lots of info on the book that he's written. Just a lot of stuff to check out. It is objective-ce.com. And thanks again to Patrick Wardle for joining us today. If you're looking for more security news and how-tos, the place to look is securemac.com/checklist. There you'll find notes for this show, for all the shows that we've done, and you can actually listen to every show right there as well. It all starts in one place, SecureMac.com/checklist. If you like the checklist, could you do us a favor? Review this show wherever you found it, and please tell friends about the checklist. We'd really appreciate it. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.